Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're listening in on from. My name is Katie Flower, and welcome to another ASA ABLOY Academy virtual instructor-led training. This one is on basic fire door hardware. I have Chad Tibbetts here, one of my colleagues, helping out with the questions and answers. If during the presentation you have a question, please feel free to type it in. You have a Q&A button on your screen, or more than likely, we're going to wait until the end of the presentation. The presentation itself will be about 45 minutes, and I'll save 15 minutes at the end for any questions that you may have. This class is being recorded and will be on the ASA ABLOY Academy website for you to review as often as you want, sometime in the next 24 hours. And also within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email thanking you for your attendance. You can use that email for continuing education credit worth 1 credit hour, for self-reporting if you need credit hours for a different organization. When we have a lot of different codes and standards that we work with in the door hardware industry, and it's important to understand the purpose. Why do we have codes and standards in the first place? They provide better building construction with greater safety to the public. They provide uniformity of building laws. So whether you're doing a project in California or Illinois or Texas, the laws will be very similar. They provide a better method for policing building materials and methods. The AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, architects, contractors, they all need to be able to understand whether the building materials that are being used comply with the codes and standards, and also to provide a minimum of requirements for safeguarding life, health, public welfare, and property protection. And being someone in the door openings industry, part of our job is to educate building owners as well as architects, anybody that we come in contact with, on how to make sure that their doors and hardware comply. If a building starts off code compliant, chances are it will maintain and keep that way for the life of the building. If a building starts off with some deficiencies, which can happen, then chances are it goes downhill from there. So as part of the built environment, the more that we can educate and reach out to our customers, whether they're architects, contractors, whoever that you're working with, just make sure that they understand what it takes to be code compliant. We're the door hardware experts out there. They trust us. They want to consult with us, as in all of you. And the more that you can learn, the more that you can help, the better this built environment will be. NFPA 80 is a standard. A standard is a set of criteria by which everything else is measured. It is the standard for fire doors and hardware. And it is referenced by the building codes and different codes. And when it is referenced by the code is adopted into law, and the standard becomes part of the law based on that reference. It is referenced by local building codes, and your AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, will be the one to enforce the codes and standards. It is referenced in the International Building Code, which every state in the United States has adopted one edition or another, anywhere from the 2006 edition to the 2018 edition. And some states have not only adopted it, but have amended it and changed it in writing to what they need and have published it. For example, the California Building Code is based on the International Building Code, but they've modified it to their own requirements. NFPA 80, as I mentioned, is the standard for fire doors and other opening protectives. Opening protectives is just a fancy way of saying fire door assembly. The Life Safety Code, NFPA 101, is not a building code, but it is a means of egress and life safety code. Oftentimes you'll see that used in government work and healthcare. And if it is used in conjunction with the IBC, the International Building Code, and if there is a conflict between two or more codes or standards, the more restrictive requirement would take priority. Another standard that NFPA 80 is referenced in is ICC ANSI A117.1, which is the standard for making buildings accessible to meet ADA. A great tool and resource for you is the website www.iccsafe.org. If you have a project in an area in a state that you're not familiar with, you can type in the state and it will tell you which building codes are in effect for that state. I would also recommend that you Google the city. I know, for example, the city of Dallas has its own building code. The city of Chicago has its own building code, and those are different from the state requirements. So if you have a large city, double check that the city doesn't have their own building code or a modification of the building code, and make sure that you apply whatever the local code is. The standard is published and updated not every 3 years like the code, but 3 to 6 years and sometimes even longer in between. And it's very important to understand which one is being referenced if you're working on a particular project and you're using the International Building Code 2015 edition or NFPA 101, the 2015 edition. They reference NFPA 80, the 2013 edition. And since the IBC 2015 is the most widely adopted of the IBC editions, I'm using NFPA 80 2013 and IBC 2015 as my point of reference. Make sure that if you're under a different version, that you get familiar with the specifics of that version. In Chapter 1, it's a general chapter to the rest of the standard. They talk about equivalency. 1.4.1, the standard shall not prohibit the development of new, modified, or improved devices that meet the intent of these requirements. If something, let's say it takes 6 years or 12 years in between the printing of a new standard, a lot can change in technology for doors and hardware. And if a manufacturer has passed a fire door test with a new particular type of hardware, this standard is not trying to stop you from innovating or from coming up with new improved devices. The manufacturer would need to furnish that information through the door hardware distributor to the architect, who would then get it to the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction. And that's usually cut sheets and possibly even a UL listing that comes off the UL website, something like that. But you can always work with your DSS, whoever your rep is. They can help you find the information you need if there's a new product that the fire marshal needs more information on. A few NFPA specific definitions. The word approved, when we see that in a code or standard, it means acceptable to the authority having jurisdiction. And the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, is defined as an organization, office, or individual that's responsible for enforcing the requirements of a code or standard, or for approving equipment, materials, an installation, or a procedure. The term labeled, and this is again a specific to NFPA definition. It is equipment or materials to which has been attached a label, a symbol, or other identifying mark of an organization that is acceptable to the AHJ, that is concerned with product evaluation and maintains periodic inspection of the production of the labeled equipment or materials, and by whose labeling the manufacturer indicates compliance with appropriate standards or performance in a specified manner. Exit devices, they're UL listed. UL Underwriters Laboratory is that third-party organization that tests and classifies. They test for a lot of different things. They can test for panic rating. They can test for UL10C, which is fire rating. And those are the two main things that we would be concerned with. But Underwriters Laboratory tests microwave ovens and all different kinds of materials that have nothing to do with doors and hardware at all. So make sure that if you do need something that is labeled, make sure that it's labeled for the appropriate, in our case, fire rating. UL10C means that it is labeled for use on a fire-rated door. Shall indicates a mandatory requirement, and should indicates a recommendation, something that's advised but not required. The annexes, the appendixes in the back of any of the NFPA documents have further explanatory material. Let's say they want to explain why an electric strike has to be a certain way. The explanation itself may include some information where they use the term should, but the actual standard or the code that's where you're going to see the term shall. All fire doors shall be labeled, and shall is mandatory. Another definition, a fire door assembly. If you have a customer walk in and say, I need a fire door, chances are they need the entire assembly, which is any combination of the fire door, frame, and hardware that together with accessories provide a specific degree of fire protection to the opening. And so make sure that they're a little more specific. If they say, I need a fire door, if they've got an existing frame, you may need to go out and measure it and take a look at what they have for hardware preps and things like that. A fire protection rating is, for the purposes of this standard, the designation indicating the duration of the fire test exposure for which a fire door assembly or fire window assembly was exposed and which it successfully met all of the criteria as determined by NFPA 252, which can either test under standard neutral pressure or positive pressure. And the code itself requires all swinging doors to be tested under UL10C positive pressure. Classification of fire doors and windows will be designated with a required fire protection rating expressed in either hours or fractions of hours, and or an alphabetical letter designation, or a combination of both. And the letter designation, the class of the fire door, describes the type of opening and the type of wall where it goes in a building. The rating is the actual hour designation of the fire protection rating that the door has passed the test. An A-label door is 3 hours, and those are used in firewalls to separate two different types of buildings. They're very rare, but if you have a 3-hour door, the requirements for hardware will be slightly different than any of the other ratings, and that's because it's the most restrictive rating that they make. A B-label door is either going to be 60-minute or 90-minute, depending on the height of the building, and those are used in fire barriers, which will, for the most part, separate your exits. So vertical exits, your stairs, horizontal exits, your corridor, cross-corridor doors that separate the building into two fire compartments, no larger than 22,500 square feet for that fire compartment, and other types of fire barriers for laundry rooms and storage rooms and things like that. Laundry rooms and storage rooms are typically going to be 1-hour walls with C-label doors, and C-label is 45-minute. So when you hear the two, they're synonymous with each other. And they're allowed to have quite a bit more glass in them than a B-label door. And it's all about where these doors are located within a building. D&E label doors are exterior fire-rated doors. They too are rare, but if you have a city and you're within 10 feet of another building, we don't want the fire to spread from one building to another building and then to another building. So if you're within 10 feet of another building, that exterior door would need to be fire-rated. Or if you're going out onto a fire escape, fire escapes are no longer a means of egress component. They're a means of escape. And people aren't building new fire escapes in new construction for the most part. So again, exterior fire rated doors are very rare. The lowest level of protection is a 20-minute door. These are used in exit access corridors, in fire partitions, and in smoke barriers. And their main job is to stay closed and latched for the 20 minutes, prevent the spread of fire, but also prevent the spread of smoke. Builder's hardware, by definition, that is our stuff. Hardware for fire doors shall be referred to as builder's hardware or fire door hardware. Fire door hardware is not our stuff. Builder's hardware includes fire exit hardware, which is an exit device that's rated for both panic and fire. And in this standard, builder's hardware shall be applied only to swinging doors. Builder's hardware is not required to be shipped from the factory with the fire doors. They're not an assembled unit. So you can have your hardware shipped from Sargent and McKinney and Rockwood, and you can have your door frame shipped from Seco, and potentially metal fire doors from Seco and wood doors from wherever. They get to the job site, the contractor installs them as one complete unit at the job site. Fire exit hardware consists of exit devices that are both fire and panic protection. Only labeled fire doors shall be used, and swinging doors are permitted to have separate labeled door and frame and hardware components from different fire door inspection agencies. So for example, you may have a Warnock-Hersey door that's hung on UL listed butt hinges in a factory mutual rated frame. They can be different third-party inspection agencies. As long as they meet the requirements of the standard for whatever the fire protection rating is, you're fine. The label itself will give you the hourly rating. Sometimes it'll also have that letter designation. It tells you who the third party is that does the inspection on the doors and the minimum latch projection, as well as if the door is to be used for fire exit hardware, it'll say it right on the label itself. And the manufacturer's logo or name is also on the label. You may need to contact the manufacturer down the road if you need to make a modification to that door. And every label has a serial number on it, so they can track from the factory if anything goes wrong and somebody modified that fire door beyond what they were supposed to do, they can track it and find out based on this serial number. Swinging doors shall be closed and latched at the time of fire. There are some exceptions to that rule, and that will be found in the code for the most part. The code is capable of granting exceptions because there are some trade-offs. The code recognizes that the risk factors involved for fire doors and doors in a means of egress are how many people are present, which is called the occupant load, and how the building is used, the occupancy type. And so the code does not treat a small McDonald's that has 20 customers the same as a high school that has 5,000 students. So there may be exceptions based on how many people are there, how large the building is, and also whether the building is fully sprinklered or not. And there's a lot of different reasons, but usually it's a trade-off. If there's an exception, it's because they're being more restrictive with something else that we're not involved with. So there are some fire doors that are allowed to not be closed, or that are allowed to not be positive latching. But unless by exception, all swinging doors shall be closed and latched at the time of fire. For the purposes of 6.13, the operation of doors is divided into 3 categories. Self-closing doors. You open the door, let go, and that door closes. Automatic closing doors is the second. You push a button or put your hand in front of a switch, the door opens automatically and will close automatically. Usually there's some kind of spring in there. And then, I'm sorry, that was the power operated fire door. Automatic closing is with a magnetic hold open. It can either be built into the door closer or like the one on the picture in the bottom right, mounted on the wall. The magnetic hold open, the door is normally held open, but it's tied into the fire alarm system, and the magnetic hold open is fail safe. On loss of power or signal from the fire alarm, that door will close automatically. And power operated is if you have the wall sensor to either push on or wave your hand in front of, it opens the door automatically, but it needs to have some kind of closing device in it as well. Hanging requirements are based on the table 6.4.3.1, and chapter 6 is where we're going to get all of our door hardware information in this standard, because this deals with builder's hardware of all types. So hinges, spring hinges, continuous hinges, and pivots shall be as specified by the individual door manufacturer's published listing, hardware manufacturer's published listing. And if they don't have something separate, unusual, different, then it's per this table. So by and large, butt hinges need to be steel-based metal, so they're high temperature threshold, and either mortise or surface type hinges. Spring hinges, where they're used, at least 2 shall be provided, and spring hinges shall be labeled. You see the UL emblem, that is a labeled spring hinge. Hinges or pivots, except for spring hinges, shall be of the ball bearing type. If they're not ball bearing, they do accept other anti-friction bearing like the McKinney TA hinge. That is totally permissible because it meets the requirements of ANSI BHMA A156.1 for butts and hinges. So you're fine using either the TA or the TB. The ball bearing or the anti-friction bearing are both acceptable for use on fire doors. Pivot sets consisting of floor or jam mounted bottom and head mounted top pivots installed on door leaves up to 90 inches shall have at least 1 intermediate pivot. And for every 30 inches or fraction thereof, you need 1 additional intermediate pivot. Continuous hinges, the length shall be within 1 inch of the height of the door leaves. Hinges shall be secured per the manufacturer's installation instructions, and mortise hinges using steel machine screws. Hinges attached to frames with steel screws, and the types of screws vary depending on the material used. Shimming, when it's required to meet the clearances, steel shims shall be permitted. I have a short video on the proper way to shim a fire door.
Welcome to this installment of Dave's Door Opening. This video will cover the basic steps to properly shim a door. The instructions you see can be used in any type of door, steel, wood, fiberglass, or aluminum, using butt hinges. We recommend using small shims instead of the full-width shims you sometimes see in the field. The smaller size shims can achieve more movement and can be used to either push the door to the lock side or even pull the door towards the hinge side. You can see we have 2 types of shims in this picture. The metal shim on the left is for fire-rated openings. The plastic shim on the right is for non-rated openings. We do not recommend using paper or cardboard for shim material. Both these materials will break down over time. You can buy shims with stick-on material on one side for easy installation. Check your local hardware store for more information. This chart shows placement of the shim and the effect on the opening. If you have a gap on the lock side you need to reduce, you simply add required shims to the edge of the frame closest to the barrel of the hinge. This will push the doors towards the lock side of the opening. Always tighten the 2 hinge screws opposite the location of the shim first. This will maximize the effect of the shim. This chart also shows placement of the shim and its effect on the opening. If you have a gap on the hinge side you need to reduce, you simply add required shims to the edge of the hinge farthest from the barrel of the hinge. This will pull the doors towards the hinge side of the opening. If you only need to close up the hinge side gap on the top of the door, add shims only to the top hinge, farthest from the barrel of the hinge. Keep in mind, when you only shim the top or bottom hinge, you will also lift the lock side of the door in the opening. For example, if you only shim the top of the door, pulling the door towards the hinge side, this will also decrease the gap at the top edge of the door on the lock side and increase the gap on the lock side towards the top. If you only need to close up the lock side gap towards the top of the door, add shims only to the top hinge. Just like the previous chart, if you only add shims to the top hinge, you will drop the lock side of the door in the opening. This will also increase the gap at the top of the door on the lock side. Always tighten the 2 hinge screws opposite the location of the shim first. This will maximize the effect of the shimming. Here's a very typical opening. You will notice that the gap on the top hinge side is a bit large, and the gap on the top lock side is almost non-existent. Also note the large gap at the top of the door on the lock side. To correct this issue, we will install shims in the top hinge opposite the barrel side of the hinge. Start the shimming process by removing the top hinge butt on the frame. Set the hinge screws to the side. Remove protective film from the sticky side of the shim. Note how we pop the hinge out of the frame by hitting the door with our hand. This saves from trying to pry the hinge butt out of the frame. Place shim in the correct location. For this application, the shim will be placed away from the hinge barrel. Install hinge screws back into the hinge butt. Note you will always install the 2 screws opposite the shim side of the hinge butt. This maximizes the effect of the shimming. Here's the before and after pictures of the gaps on the doors. Notice the gaps are now more uniform. The door moved away from the lock edge and closer to the hinge edge. We have pulled the door towards the hinge edge with just a shim placed at the top hinge.
Only labeled locks and latches or labeled fire exit hardware meeting both life safety requirements and fire protection requirements shall be used. You can see here is a Sergeant 11 line UL listed. It says for Canada and US, and then it also has F for fire, so you know that it's fire rated. When it comes to a fire exit hardware, it needs to be installed on a fire door bearing the label that says fire door to be equipped with fire exit hardware. When you hear that a door needs to have positive latching, that's a spring-loaded latch bolt. When you turn the lever, you're retracting the latch bolt, you let go of the lever, the latch bolt springs back into the hole in the strike. Same thing with an exit device. You push in on an exit device rail, you're retracting the latch bolt, you can exit the door. As soon as you let go of the push rail, the spring-loaded latch pops back out and gives positive latching on that fire door. All single doors and active leaves of pairs of doors shall be provided with an active latch bolt that cannot be held in the retracted position as specified by the individual manufacturer's published listing. On exit devices, that means that mechanical dogging is not permitted on a fire-rated opening, because imagine if you had these mechanically dogged with the hex key, somebody, when the fire alarm sounds, would have to go around and undog every exit device before they could leave the building. And man, that job would not be a good, fun job to have. Instead, what we do is the latching arrangements that do not provide positive latching in the normal mode shall be permitted to be used, provided that in a fire emergency, the door becomes positively latched by means of an automatic fail-safe device activated by an automatic fire detector. The electric latch retraction, that would be the 56 prefix for the Sergeant device, or the MELR on the Corbin-Russwin device. And that can be tied into the fire alarm system to release the latch. You can dog the exit device bar and use it like push-pull. Fire alarm releases and makes the door positive latching. Deadbolts are permitted on fire doors as long as they're not within a means of egress. Doors that are not in a means of egress are permitted to be provided with a deadbolt in addition to the active latch bolt as permitted by the AHJ. If you do have a door that is a fire door in a means of egress, like the little video clip, the deadbolt has to be interconnected with the latch bolt for one motion free egress. You turn the lever, you're retracting both the deadbolt and the latch bolt at the same time. That is permitted on a fire door in a means of egress. A regular auxiliary deadbolt is permitted on a fire door that's not in a means of egress. Where both leaves are required for exit purposes, they shall be provided with labeled fire exit hardware. A fire-rated pair of doors that swing in both directions, a double egress pair, both leaves are required for exit purposes, and therefore both leaves would need an exit device to latch them. Also, if you have a pair of doors that swing in the same direction, based on the occupant load, a single door leaf that's 3 foot wide allows the exiting of 165 people. If you know that you're an auditorium and you've got 5,000 people, then you know that both leaves of that pair of doors are needed for exit purposes. If you have a pair of doors going into a storeroom and very low occupancy, you would only need an exit device on one leaf if it needed an exit device in the first place. Open back strikes are permitted on pairs of doors as long as the door manufacturer has tested and can label it. Metal doors, because they can be reinforced, you see how much meat that this open back strike takes out the edge of the door. Metal doors can be reinforced, and therefore I don't know of any hollow metal door manufacturers that can't prep for this. Most everyone that I've seen can. But wood doors, 20-minute, 45, 60, and 90-minute wood doors, you have to check with the manufacturer to see if that's something that they have tested and listed. Chances are very good, because of the amount that has to be removed, chances are good that they cannot pass the test with an open back strike. Automatic flush bolts, when you have a pair of doors that's needed for the movement of equipment and you don't need the inactive leaf for exit purposes, you can use labeled top and bottom self-latching or automatic flush bolts. Manual flush bolts can be used in a room that's not normally occupied and does not pose a hazard to safety to life. You would have to check Chapter 10 of your IBC for your means of egress requirements, but typically this would be storage room or a mechanical room that's not normally occupied. The inactive leaf would not require a door closer and could use manual or surface bolts. Electric strikes shall be permitted instead of the conventional strike for single doors and also for pairs of doors provided for in the published listing. It's important to understand that with an electric strike, because the keeper on the electric strike is what is being released, it has to be a fail-secure electric strike in order to provide the positive latching. Additionally, you want to make sure that the electric strike is UL 10C rated. Not all electric strikes have a fire rating. Look in your cut sheet and make sure that it is listed for UL 10C fire and not just UL for burglary resistant. A lot of your electric strikes, it'll say UL rated, but if you look at the fine print, it says UL for burglary resistance. Make sure it's UL 10C for fire. Unless otherwise permitted by the AHJ, a closing device shall be installed on every fire door. As I mentioned, there are some exceptions to this. The code itself is where you will find those exceptions. All closing mechanisms shall be adjusted to overcome the resistance of the latch mechanism so that positive latching is achieved on each door operation. Door closers get their power from the spring, and a surface-mounted door closer is not 100% efficient. Fire-rated openings take priority over ADA. ADA says 5 pounds of opening force maximum on all doors except for fire doors, because ADA recognizes that 5 pounds of opening force may not be enough to close and latch the door. So ADA does recognize and say that the 5 pounds of opening force is for interior non-fire rated doors. And NFPA 80 also says the closing mechanism must be adjusted to overcome the resistance of the latch mechanism so that positive latching is achieved on each door operation. Sometimes you'll use a door holder release device where it's electromechanical tied to the fire alarm system. That's fine as long as it's been tested and the individual manufacturer's published listing. Coordinators. When you have an Astragal or a projecting latch bolt from an automatic flush bolt that prevents the inactive door from closing and latching before the active leaf closes and latches, a coordinating device shall be used. There are 2 types. The one in the video is a soffit-mounted coordinator. If you have an equal leaf pair, make sure that you get the appropriate size for the full width of the opening, including the filler bar. This one is an unequal leaf pair, and the filler bar needs to be shorter than normal, and the active part of the coordinator needs to be wider than normal. Make sure that you're looking at those details. You could also use a gravity type coordinator that mounts on the header of the door frame and projects. It's not exactly aesthetically pleasing, but it gets the job done. So if you have an overlapping Astragal or if you have a projecting latch bolt from an automatic flush bolt, then you need a coordinator to make sure the doors close in the proper sequence. The next set of items are not required by code, but if you use them and they're on a fire door, they must meet the requirements of this standard. So viewers, if you use a viewer in a fire door, it has to be labeled. And in this case, you see the label right here. Protection plates. Labeling shall not be required where the top of the protection plate is not more than 16 inches above the bottom of the door. But we have more than just kick plates. Sometimes we have a stretcher plate, which is a 4 to 6 inch high plate mounted at the middle section of the door. That would need to have a UL or some kind of labeling. Armor plates, they take up half the height of the door and they protect the door against carts and stretchers and beds banging into the door itself. They're above 16 inches. They would need to be labeled. Other accessories. A maglock can be used on a fire-rated door. A maglock does not provide positive latching, so you need to have some kind of a passage set or some type of other positive latching device. And you can see that they're UL10C listed, which means that you can use them on a fire-rated opening. But again, you still have to have a positive latch, and you need to meet all of the requirements for special locking arrangements under means of egress, which is Chapter 10 of the IBC. An Astragal. When you have doors swinging in pairs located within a means of egress, they shall not be equipped with an Astragal that inhibits the free use of either leaf. On double egress pairs, you can put an overlapping Astragal and it will not inhibit the free use of either leaf because the doors swing in opposite directions. But on same swing pairs, don't use an overlapping Astragal. And the only pairs of doors that require an overlapping Astragal to maintain the fire rating are 3-hour pairs of doors. And they're very rare. If you do get that combination, then just make sure that that pair of doors is not within a means of egress. Gasketing is not required on all fire-rated doors. but if you use it, it does need to meet the published listings of the door frame or gasketing material manufacturer. The type at the top is like the Pemco S88. It's a compression silicone with adhesive back, and that is smoke seal. Or the one on the bottom is like the Pemco HSS 2000, which is an intumescent gasketing that would be used on positive pressure category B fire doors that doesn't have the concealed intumescent built into the edge of the wood door. You would not use this on a metal door. A metal door will expand when it heats up. A wood door doesn't expand. And that's why a wood door would require this either frame applied or built into the edge of the door. And most commonly, you will see an architect specify it concealed in the edge of the door because this isn't that aesthetically pleasing. Threshold, when you use a threshold on a fire rated opening, it needs to be non-combustible or listed. And you will see in the Pemco catalog, the flame, and it says 10C. It also shows the wheelchair symbol. So this is fire rated and this is ADA accessible. And this threshold could be used on a fire rated ADA type door. That is it for the meat and potatoes of the presentation. This session has been recorded and you can review it as often as you want. Go to the Assa Abloy Academy website and click on the virtual instructor-led training. On the top right-hand corner will be the link to the different recordings. And there's all kinds of classes on the schedule that you can sign up for, whether they are the VILT virtual instructor-led training like this one, or we have a large variety of online classes that you could take to continue your education as well. Thank you everybody for your attendance, and I hope to see you again at another Assa Abloy Academy webinar in the near future. Have a great day and stay safe.